There is something quietly remarkable about the way a single manga panel, ink pressed into paper in 1984, eventually became the foundation for over 100 video games spanning nearly 40 years of history. Long before anyone fully understood what Dragon Ball would become, the first seeds of its interactive legacy were already being planted. Developers in small Tokyo offices were looking at Goku's wide, curious eyes and asking themselves a question that would echo across decades. How do we let people step inside this world? Tonight, we trace the answer to that question, slowly and gently, from the very beginning. So settle in wherever you are, let your shoulders lower, subscribe if this kind of calm suits you, and drift with me now through the long and quiet history of every Dragon Ball game ever made. Starting with a small cartridge released in Japan in the year 1986, during a time when video games were still learning what they could be, the Dragon Ball franchise was barely 2 years old when its first video game arrived. It came in the form of a console release for the Super Cassette Vision, a system manufactured by a Japanese company called Epoch. The game was titled Dragon Ball Daimao Fukatsu in some references, though it has also been catalogued under variant names depending on the regional documentation. It was released in 1986, and while it was not the absolute first Dragon Ball product to appear on an electronic screen, a small number of handheld LCD games had come before it. It holds the distinction of being the first Dragon Ball experience on a home console. The Super Cassette Vision was not the most powerful machine of its era. It competed in a market that also included the Famicom, and by most measures it was the lesser platform. And yet, it received the first Dragon Ball game perhaps simply because the licensing opportunity arose before others did. The game itself was an on-rails shooter, the kind of experience that placed the player in a fixed forward-moving perspective and asked them to deal with whatever came from the edges of the screen. You played as Goku riding the flying Nimbus through an increasingly crowded sky. Enemies descended from above and approached from the sides, and Goku could respond with a ki blast or by swinging the power pole forward. The controls were simple: up, down, left, right, and one attack, and the presentation was appropriately limited by the hardware. But the sprites were recognizable. The Nimbus was yellow and rounded. Goku was small and earnest-looking. For 1986, it communicated something truthful about the world it was representing. The game looped through a single scrolling level structure, asking only that the player survive as long as possible. There was no story mode, no ending to reach, no dialogue. It was, by modern terms, almost pure reflex, an arcade-style experience made for short sessions and simple goals. There was music, too, a rendition of Mystical Adventure, the theme from the original Dragon Ball anime, played throughout. Whether any additional music existed in the game's data remains a point of quiet curiosity among those who have catalogued its contents. One detail that is often overlooked: the game included a small secondary segment featuring Master Roshi. If the player guided Goku's Nimbus over a particular point on the scrolling map, a brief fighting game encounter would trigger. In this encounter, the player had to land a set number of hits against Roshi before being hit that many times first. It was rough and imprecise by any measure, but it showed an early awareness on the part of its developers that Dragon Ball's identity included not just movement and flight, but also the particular drama of one-on-one combat. The game did not travel far outside Japan. It remains a curiosity item today, something to be appreciated for what it represented rather than for what it was. Before you drift into sleep, you're welcome to subscribe for more calm Dragon Ball stories. And if you feel like it, tell me where you're listening from tonight. Later in 1986, a second Dragon Ball game appeared, and this one landed on a significantly more visible platform. Dragon Ball Shenron no Nazo was released for the Nintendo Famicom in Japan in late 1986, and it carried a noticeably more ambitious design. Where the Super Cassette Vision game had been a simple shooter, Shenron no Nazo was an action-adventure, a top-down brawler that walked players through a retelling of the early Dragon Ball story. Goku could run, jump, punch, and fire a ranged Kamehameha attack when he had collected enough of the small turtle shell icons scattered through each stage. The world moved through overhead environments that represented the forests, plains, and roads of early Dragon Ball geography. Enemies wandered in fixed paths. Boss encounters required patience and timing. The game had, by Famicom standards, a considerable amount of visual detail. Backgrounds were distinct from level to level. Characters were drawn with enough care that they remained identifiable despite their small pixel dimensions. The game's health system was unusual. Rather than a conventional health bar that depleted with each hit, Shenron no Nazo used a timer-based life meter. Your health was always counting down. Slowly but continuously, and absorbing damage accelerated that descent. This design created a sense of constant gentle urgency. You were never fully at rest, never entirely safe. For players who encountered it without preparation, the system could be disorienting. There were items to collect throughout the stages. Food restored the depleting life meter, providing brief reprieves from its downward pull. The power pole could be picked up in certain areas and briefly extended Goku's attack range. And then there were the underwear items, which served the somewhat unusual function of increasing Goku's movement speed. This detail, strange as it sounds, was meaningful. Moving faster allowed you to collect items more efficiently and avoid damage more reliably, making those small clothing items among the more strategically useful pickups in the game. In 1988, the game made its way to North America. However, by that point, Dragon Ball was largely unknown to American audiences. The decision was made to strip the game of its Dragon Ball identity almost entirely. Character designs were altered. Recognizable faces were redrawn as generic fantasy characters. The Dragon Balls themselves were replaced with different collectibles. Even the underwear items were changed, converted into sandwiches, which increased speed through the rather more conventional logic of a satisfying meal. The game was released under the title Dragon Power in North America, with little marketing and limited distribution. It was one of many licensed titles that arrived in Western markets during the Famicom era without the context needed to give it meaning. Most players who encountered it had no knowledge of what it had originally been. It played identically to its Japanese source, which meant it was still quite hard, still governed by that quietly ticking life meter, still populated by the same waves of wandering enemies, still featuring the same side-scrolling boss encounters that placed Goku against larger characters in a slightly different camera perspective. A version of the game was also released in France, where Dragon Ball had already found a stronger foothold than in North America. The French release restored the Dragon Ball branding and the original character designs, though certain other alterations remained in place for reasons that have never been fully documented. It was a small detail in the larger story of how Dragon Ball crossed cultural borders, but it illustrated the uneven, sometimes irregular path those early years represented. By 1992, the Famicom was aging gracefully, and Dragon Ball Z had transformed the franchise into something enormous. Dragon Ball Z, Gekko Tenkaichi Budokai, was released for the Famicom in Japan in that year, and it introduced a concept that was unlike anything Dragon Ball had used before. The game was designed around a Bandai peripheral called the Detach Joint ROM System, a small card-reading attachment that connected to the Famicom and allowed the system to read barcodes printed on collectible cards. The game could not be played without the cards. This was not an optional feature or a bonus mechanic. It was the foundation of the entire experience. To select a character, you had to physically scan a card. To assign that character particular abilities or statistical attributes, you scanned additional cards. The deck you brought to a session determined the characters you could use, the power levels those characters would fight at, and the skills available to them during battles. Each character in the game had multiple cards associated with them. A Goku card might represent his base form, while a separate card represented his Super Saiyan transformation, with higher base statistics and different available techniques. Frieza appeared in multiple forms, each on its own card, each carrying the statistical signature appropriate to that stage of his power. Characters who underwent transformations throughout Dragon Ball Z were thus represented not as single entries, but as collections of cards, each one a different aspect of a single fighter's story. The game's combat was simple by later standards, a turn-based system with visual flourishes, the kind of fighting framework that was common to portable and peripheral-based games of that era. But the card system gave it a secondary layer that extended far beyond the screen. Collecting and organizing cards was part of the experience. Trading them with other players added a social dimension. The game was, in a quiet way, one of the earliest examples of the collectible card game model being applied to a Dragon Ball video game property. The data text system itself was used for several other Bandai titles during the same period, and Dragon Ball Z, Gekko Tenkaichi Budokai, was among its more notable releases. The peripheral never left Japan, which meant the game remained exclusively domestic. Today, the cards themselves are collector's items, small rectangles of paper and ink that carry the barcodes of characters who no longer need them to be summoned. As the early 1990s continued, a series of role-playing games began to emerge on the Famicom and later on the Super Famicom, and these titles approached Dragon Ball Z's story in a more expansive way than the action games had managed. Dragon Ball Z Kyoshu Saiyan was released for the Famicom in Japan in 1990. It was a turn-based role-playing game that covered the Saiyan saga, the arrival of Raditz, the death of Goku, the training of the Z fighters, and the eventual confrontation with Vegeta and Nappa. The battle system presented fights from a side-on perspective, with each character selecting actions from a menu before the exchange of blows was animated across the screen. The game made a number of design choices that would become common to Dragon Ball RPGs in subsequent years. Characters could be leveled up through experience gained in battle. Skills and techniques were unlocked as those characters advanced. Story sequences recreated key moments from the anime with simple but recognizable artwork, using text boxes and static portraits to convey the emotional weight of scenes that the anime had made memorable. What distinguished this entry was how faithfully it treated the source material. The Saiyan saga had been a dramatic shift in Dragon Ball's tone, darker, more consequential, populated by enemies who could not simply be punched into reform. The game captured that gravity. Raditz's arrival was presented with appropriate menace. Goku's sacrifice was not glossed over. Piccolo's grudging cooperation with the people he had once opposed was rendered with the kind of nuance that text-based narration allowed. Two subsequent RPGs followed on the Famicom, Dragon Ball Z Gekishin Frieza in 1991, covering the Namek and Frieza sagas, and Dragon Ball Z Super Saiyan Densetsu, also released in 1992. Super Saiyan Densetsu was notable for combining the content of both earlier games into a single revised experience, adding new story elements and refining the systems that had been introduced in the earlier titles. It was released in both Japan and France, extending the game's reach beyond its domestic origins. These RPGs were patient games. They asked players to invest time in the same way that the anime asked viewers to invest attention. Slowly, through accumulation, through the understanding that each scene led into the next, and that the destination mattered less than the journey toward it, that quality of patience was something that Dragon Ball games would revisit many times over the decades that followed. By 1993, Dragon Ball Z had completed its middle sagas and was in the midst of the Cell saga. The Super Famicom had replaced the original Famicom as the dominant home console in Japan, and developers were eager to bring Dragon Ball Z into this new hardware generation. Dragon Ball Z Super Butoden was released for the Super Famicom in 1993, and it represented a significant shift in how Dragon Ball games were designed. Where the earlier titles had been RPGs, on-rail shooters, or card-based experiences, Super Butoden was a one-on-one fighting game, and it arrived at a moment when fighting games were redefining what the medium could be. Street Fighter II had been released 2 years earlier and had transformed the fighting game genre entirely. Super Butoden existed within that wake. It was a two-dimensional fighter with a roster drawn from Dragon Ball Z's cast, a health bar for each fighter, and a set of special moves that could be executed with specific controller inputs. The characters were larger and more detailed than anything Dragon Ball games had featured before, and the backgrounds were rendered with a depth that made each arena feel like a place rather than a surface. The roster included Goku, Gohan, Vegeta, Trunks, Piccolo, Cell, and others, each carrying the visual design and signature moves appropriate to their role in the story. Goku's Kamehameha was present, launched in the traditional way, cupped hands pulled back, energy gathered, the beam released forward in a cone of blue light. Vegeta's Gallic gun occupied the same conceptual space, but was cast in a different color, a purple-tinged beam that reflected his particular energy signature. Super Butoden was followed by two direct sequels, Super Butoden 2, released in 1993 as well. Expanded the roster and added new gameplay systems, including a pursuit mechanic that allowed combatants to chase each other across the vertical space of the arena. Super Butoden 3, released in 1994, continued the refinement and introduced fighters from the later portions of the Cell saga and early into the Buu arc. Each game in the series built carefully on the one before it, accumulating small improvements that added up to something noticeably more polished by the end. These games were regional releases, distributed in Japan and in France and Spain, where Dragon Ball Z had found large and devoted audiences. They did not reach North America in their original form, which meant that an entire generation of Western players grew up without access to this particular branch of Dragon Ball gaming history. The series is remembered warmly by those who played it in its home regions, and it established the fighting game as the genre Dragon Ball would most frequently return to across all the years that followed. While the Super Famicom received the larger, more elaborate Dragon Ball releases, the quieter parallel history was unfolding on handheld devices. The Game Boy, Nintendo's portable platform, received its first Dragon Ball title in 1990. Dragon Ball Goku Hishoden was a role-playing game that compressed the early Dragon Ball story into the small screen of a device that could be carried in a jacket pocket. The game used the same general framework as the Famicom RPGs: turn-based battles, overhead exploration, text-based story sequences, but translated it into a form that could be paused mid-journey and returned to later. Handheld Dragon Ball games occupied a unique position in the franchise's gaming history. Because they were portable, they were often a first point of contact for younger players. A child given a Game Boy during a long car journey or a school holiday would find in these Dragon Ball games a patient, self-paced introduction to the characters and stories that the anime presented in motion and sound. The games filled in the gaps. They were there when the television was not. Over the years of the Game Boy and its successor platforms, dozens of Dragon Ball titles were released. Some were original adventures, others were adaptations of specific sagas. A few were straightforward fighting games with reduced rosters that fit within the platform's technical constraints. Each one was shaped by the hardware it ran on, simpler in presentation, quieter in sound, more reliant on imagination to complete what the visuals could only suggest. Dragon Ball Z Goku Hishoden on the Game Boy was followed in 1991 by Dragon Ball Z Gekito Tenkaichi Budokai, and then in 1992 by Dragon Ball Z Buyu Retsuden on the Game Gear, Sega's rival handheld platform, which ran at full color and offered a slightly different aesthetic to the experiences it hosted. The Game Gear version was notably vibrant, its character sprites benefiting from the platform's color palette in ways the original monochrome Game Boy could not match. These handheld games rarely received the same critical attention as their console counterparts. They were treated as companion pieces, useful, charming, inherently limited by their format, but for the players who grew up with them, they were something closer to essential. They were where Dragon Ball could be taken anywhere. They were where the story continued even when the television was turned off. Sega's Mega Drive, known as the Genesis in North America, received a number of Dragon Ball Z titles during the early 1990s, and among these the most significant was Dragon Ball Z, Buyu Retsuden. Released in 1994 in Europe, Buyu Retsuden was a one-on-one fighting game with a roster of 12 characters and a visual style that leaned heavily on the Mega Drive's ability to render large, detailed sprites. The characters were drawn with a specificity that matched the anime. Each fighter's posture, costume, and color palette was recognizable at a glance, even at the game's relatively small display resolution. The game was notable for including characters from the Cell Saga alongside those from the earlier portions of Dragon Ball Z's story, which meant that fighters like Perfect Cell and both the Super Saiyan transformations of Goku and Gohan appeared on the same roster as characters from the Namek era. The mixing of timeline contexts was something that fighting game rosters had always done by necessity, but in Dragon Ball's case, it produced an interesting kind of imaginary simultaneity. A world in which all of the story's most powerful moments existed at the same time, available to be placed against each other. The Mega Drive received additional Dragon Ball titles as well. Dragon Ball Z L'Appel du Destin was released in France and covered story events with a similar fighting game structure. These European releases acknowledged the size and devotion of the French Dragon Ball fanbase, which had been consuming the manga and anime since the late 1980s, and had developed the kind of deep familiarity with the material that produced passionate players. The Mega Drive era was brief in the context of Dragon Ball gaming history. The platform was soon overtaken by the PlayStation and Nintendo 64, and the Dragon Ball games migrated with the audience. But the Mega Drive titles left a quiet impression on the players who found them, and they remain part of the longer story of how a manga became a medium-spanning phenomenon. The PlayStation arrived in Japan in 1994 and in North America in 1995, and with it came a new era of Dragon Ball game development. The first significant PlayStation Dragon Ball title was Dragon Ball Z Ultimate Battle 22, released in Japan in 1995 and reaching North America and Europe in 1996 and 1997 respectively. Its title referred to its roster count, 22 playable characters, a number that seemed impressive at the time and spoke to the ambition of Dragon Ball games as they moved into the age of 3D hardware. The game was a two-dimensional fighter at its core, but it used pre-rendered three-dimensional environments as its backgrounds, an aesthetic choice that was common to the PlayStation era. When developers were exploring how to blend the new visual possibilities of 3D rendering with the familiar gameplay structures of 2D mechanics, the characters themselves were hand-drawn, their sprites maintaining the flat but expressive quality of the anime's animation, while the world behind them receded into digital depth. Ultimate Battle 22 was one of the first Dragon Ball games to receive a significant North American release, arriving on store shelves at a time when Dragon Ball Z was beginning its slow introduction to Western audiences through home video releases and early cable television appearances. For many North American players, this PlayStation game was among their first direct interactions with Dragon Ball Z characters in an interactive form, which meant that its imperfections were experienced without the context needed to recognize them as imperfections. They were simply what Dragon Ball felt like. The game was followed in 1997 by Dragon Ball GT Final Bout, which covered the Dragon Ball GT era, the continuation of the Dragon Ball Z story that had been developed without direct involvement from original author Akira Toriyama. Final Bout was the first Dragon Ball game to use fully three-dimensional character models rather than two-dimensional sprites. The models were simple by later standards, their polygon counts low and their animations somewhat stiff, but the choice represented an important step in the direction Dragon Ball games would continue moving across the following decade. Final Bout reached North America with almost no marketing support and in very limited quantities, which paradoxically made it something of a collector's item almost immediately. Players who knew enough about Dragon Ball to want the game sometimes had considerable difficulty finding it, while those who stumbled across it without prior knowledge found themselves holding a product they did not have the context to fully appreciate. It was an uneven introduction to a format that would eventually become familiar. The year 2001 brought a transformation in how Dragon Ball video games were made and how they were received. Dragon Ball Z Budokai was released for the PlayStation 2 in Japan in 2001 and in North America and Europe in 2002. It was developed by Dimps, a Japanese studio that had experience with fighting game development, and it was published by Atari in Western markets. The game was the first Dragon Ball title to be designed with Western audiences as a primary consideration rather than an afterthought, and it showed in the polish of its presentation and the accessibility of its mechanics. Budokai was a three-dimensional fighting game, fully realized in 3 dimensions in a way that Final Bout had only approximately suggested. Characters moved through arenas with physical weight and momentum. Camera angles shifted dynamically to follow the action. Special moves were executed with a reasonable degree of accessibility, a specific 2-button combination rather than the complex directional inputs that had characterized earlier fighting games. And the presentation throughout was deeply attentive to the source material. The game's story mode recreated the Saiyan, Namek, Android, and Cell sagas through a combination of in-engine cutscenes and still images drawn in a style that closely matched the anime's visual aesthetic. Characters spoke with voice actors who had performed those roles in the Japanese and English language versions of the series. The energy of the story was communicated with care. The stakes of each confrontation were made clear. The emotional rhythms of the major moments were respected. What Budokai introduced that would define Dragon Ball fighting games for years afterward was the capsule system. Between matches in the story mode and the versus modes, players could equip small items, capsules, to their characters that modified those characters' abilities. A capsule might increase a fighter's health capacity or improve the damage of a specific technique or allow a transformation that would otherwise not be available. The capsule system made customization a part of the experience, turning the period between fights into a small but meaningful activity. Dragon Ball Z Budokai 2, released in 2003, expanded the story coverage to include the Buu saga and introduced a board game-style world map as the structure for its story mode. Players moved character tokens across this map, fighting enemies at each space and collecting Dragon Balls that could be used to unlock additional story branches. The map made the story mode feel like an adventure as much as a series of fights, and it encouraged repeated playthroughs as players discovered paths they had missed. Dragon Ball Z Budokai 3, released in 2004, is widely remembered as the high point of the Budokai series. It expanded the roster to include characters from Dragon Ball GT, deepened the capsule customization system, introduced a Dragon Universe mode that allowed players to fly freely through a 3-dimensional world map and visit locations from the Dragon Ball storyline, and refined the combat to a degree of precision that made it compelling both as an accessible experience for new players and as a competitive platform for devoted ones. The Budokai series established Dragon Ball as a viable and attractive franchise in the Western gaming market. The games were reviewed seriously by mainstream gaming publications, sold in numbers that justified continued investment from publishers, and established a community of players who would follow Dragon Ball gaming into the years ahead with genuine enthusiasm. Alongside the Budokai series, a separate franchise was developing that would eventually become the largest Dragon Ball fighting game series in terms of roster size and scope. Dragon Ball Z, Budokai Tenkaichi, was released in 2005 for the PlayStation 2, and it represented a fundamentally different approach to the Dragon Ball fighting game. Where the Budokai games were tournament-style fighters, fixed arenas, 2 opponents, combat governed by careful inputs and tactical choices, Budokai Tenkaichi was a field-based fighter. The battle arenas were vast. Characters flew freely through 3-dimensional spaces, chasing each other across distances that made the combat feel more like the anime's extended aerial battles than anything the confined arenas of earlier games had managed. The combat in Budokai Tenkaichi operated from a third-person perspective that placed the camera directly behind the controlled character. Enemies could be at any distance, nearby for close combat, or distant enough that the player had to aim and fire energy blasts across the open space between them. The locking system tracked opponents through the air, but the distances involved meant that battles had an expansive kinetic quality that was genuinely different from what the Budokai games offered. Budokai Tenkaichi's roster was its most discussed feature. The first game included around 60 playable characters, more than any Dragon Ball game had previously offered. This was not simply a matter of including the major cast members and their primary transformations. The game distinguished between different versions of the same character at different power levels and story moments, treating Goku at the beginning of the Saiyan saga as a functionally different fighter from Goku at the end of the Cell saga. This meant that players who wanted to recreate specific story matchups could do so with a degree of accuracy that had never before been possible. Dragon Ball Z Budokai Tenkaichi 2, released in 2006, expanded the roster to over 150 characters, making it one of the largest rosters in fighting game history at that point. Characters from Dragon Ball, Dragon Ball Z, Dragon Ball GT, and the official movies were included. Obscure antagonists from filler arcs appeared alongside the central cast members. The game became a kind of comprehensive catalog of Dragon Ball character design, a document of the franchise's population rendered in interactive form. Dragon Ball Z Budokai Tenkaichi 3, released in 2007, pushed the roster further still, to over 160 playable characters, a number that has remained a benchmark in discussions of fighting game scale. The game included characters that had appeared in only a handful of scenes across the entire franchise, treating their inclusion as an act of completionism and a gift to the most devoted fans. It remains, to this day, one of the most comprehensive Dragon Ball gaming experiences ever produced in terms of sheer character coverage. While the console Dragon Ball games were reaching toward larger scales, the PSP, Sony's PlayStation Portable, was receiving its own line of Dragon Ball experiences. Dragon Ball Z Shin Budokai was released for the PSP in 2006, and it brought the Budokai-style fighting system to a handheld platform with notable fidelity. The game covered the Dragon Ball Z Fusion Reborn movie storyline, pitting the Z fighters against Janemba, one of the more visually striking antagonists to appear in the official Dragon Ball Z film catalog. The PSP's hardware was capable enough to run a version of the Budokai experience without significant compromise, and Shin Budokai's roster and mechanics translated cleanly to the portable format. The game was well received by players who wanted Dragon Ball fighting game content that could be carried and played in short sessions without the commitment of sitting at a television. Shin Budokai Another Road, the sequel released in 2007, told an original story set in a version of the Dragon Ball timeline in which future Trunks' future became more complicated, a world in which threats other than the androids were beginning to converge. The game gave future Trunks a central role and explored the emotional weight of his timeline with some care, treating the concept of an alternate future not as a curiosity but as a genuine narrative opportunity. These PSP titles occupied a specific space in the Dragon Ball gaming ecosystem. They were not the flagship experiences, but they were not afterthoughts either. They were fully realized products designed for a specific audience and delivered with the kind of attention that made them worth the time they asked for. The release of the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 brought Dragon Ball games into a new hardware generation, and the first significant title in that era was Dragon Ball Z Burst Limit. Burst Limit was released in 2008 for both the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360, the first Dragon Ball Z game to appear on Microsoft's console, and it was developed by Dimps, the same studio responsible for the original Budokai series. The game carried the visual ambitions of its hardware generation, presenting character models with a smoothness and detail that the PlayStation 2 had not been able to provide. The cell shading technique used to render the characters gave them the quality of animation cells brought into 3 dimensions. They moved like drawings rather than like polygons, which was exactly the effect the developers were pursuing. Burst Limit covered the Dragon Ball Z story from the Saiyan saga through the end of the Cell saga, stopping before the Buu arc. This narrative scope was smaller than some earlier games had managed, and it was noted as a limitation by players who had hoped for a more complete experience. The game compensated with depth rather than breadth. Each saga was covered with attention to detail. Each major confrontation was presented with dramatic weight, and the combat system had been refined to a level of responsiveness that the Budokai series had approached but not quite reached. The introduction of Z assists was one of Burst Limit's distinctive contributions. During fights, players could call upon additional characters to intervene briefly, a supporting strike, a defensive action, a momentary distraction. These assists were drawn from the supporting cast of each saga, which meant that using them carried narrative weight. Having Gohan intervene during a Goku fight in the Cell Saga felt like a direct extension of the story being told rather than a mechanical convenience. The game did not receive a direct sequel in the same hardware generation, which left the Buu Saga and Dragon Ball GT without representation in the new visual style Burst Limit had established. That absence was felt, and it redirected attention toward the next major Dragon Ball game development, one that would take a very different approach to what a Dragon Ball game could be. Dragon Ball Raging Blast was released in 2009 as a spiritual successor to the Budokai Tenkaichi series, carrying forward the field-based, third-person combat style that series had established while updating it for the capabilities of the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. The game's roster was smaller than the Tenkaichi 3 had offered, a deliberate reduction that allowed the development team to focus on the quality of each character's animations and movesets rather than simply maximizing the headcount. The arenas were more destructible than in previous games, with terrain that could be shattered by particularly powerful attacks and environmental hazards that changed the texture of fights as they progressed. Raging Blast introduced a super battle trial system that provided structured challenges alongside the standard versus and story modes. These trials gave players specific objectives: win a fight within a certain time limit, perform a set number of particular moves, defeat an opponent with a specific technique, and rewarded completion with unlockable content. The trials acknowledged that many players of Dragon Ball fighting games wanted structured guidance alongside the freedom of open combat. Dragon Ball Raging Blast 2, released in 2010, expanded the roster and added a movie battle mode that recreated confrontations from the official Dragon Ball Z films. A welcome acknowledgement that those films had produced some of the most visually and emotionally striking Dragon Ball moments outside of the main television series. Characters like Lord Slug, Cooler, and Janemba were made playable, bringing a dimension of the Dragon Ball universe that the Budokai and Tenkaichi series had addressed unevenly. The Raging Blast series did not reach the cultural prominence of the Budokai or Tenkaichi lines, but it served its players well. It was honest about what it was, a continuation of a style, not a reinvention of it, and players who had loved the Tenkaichi games found in it a familiar kind of welcome. Dragon Ball Ultimate Tenkaichi was released in 2011, and it represented an interesting experiment in the design of Dragon Ball games. The game carried the Tenkaichi name but departed significantly from the combat framework that name had previously represented. Rather than the free-range field-based combat of the Budokai Tenkaichi series, Ultimate Tenkaichi featured a more cinematic, simplified fighting system in which special moves were initiated through quick-time events and the outcomes of clashes were determined by button prompts rather than by sustained tactical input. The effect was a game that looked and felt like the Dragon Ball anime more closely than almost any previous title. The camera angles, the sense of speed, the visual spectacle of energy exchanges, while asking less of the player in terms of mechanical skill. The game's most original feature was its hero mode, which allowed players to create a custom Saiyan character and take that character through an original story set within the Dragon Ball Z universe. This original story interacted with the established continuity in careful ways. The created character existed alongside the main cast, witnessing the events of the major sagas from a different vantage point, occasionally intervening in ways that the story accommodated. The hero mode's character creation system offered options for physical appearance, fighting style, and skill selection that were modest by the standards of role-playing games but meaningful within the context of Dragon Ball gaming. Players who had always wanted to place themselves within the Dragon Ball universe found in this system an invitation they had not previously received. Critical reception to Ultimate Tenkaichi was mixed. The simplified combat system was seen by some as an accessibility improvement and by others as a reduction in depth. The hero mode was generally praised for its originality, while also being noted as limited in scope, an interesting idea that could have been developed further. The game was remembered as an experiment that pointed in interesting directions, even if it did not fully arrive at its destination. Dragon Ball Z: Battle of Z was released in 2014, and it pursued a design philosophy that was notably different from what Dragon Ball games had typically offered. Where most Dragon Ball fighting games place two characters in opposition, one against one, or at most small numbers on each side, Battle of Z was built around team combat at a larger scale. Matches could involve as many as 8 players simultaneously, 4 on each side, fighting cooperatively or competitively within the same space. The game was designed from the beginning with online multiplayer as a central consideration rather than an addendum to a single-player experience. The team combat structure produced fights that had an appropriately chaotic energy. Energy blasts crossed from multiple directions. Characters flew through the arena chasing different opponents or protecting teammates. The sense of a battle in progress, as opposed to a duel between two individuals, was achieved in a way that earlier Dragon Ball games had not attempted. The game drew on the Buu saga and the Dragon Ball Z films for much of its content, bringing the ensemble nature of those stories into the combat design. Battle of Z was received with moderate enthusiasm. It was recognized as doing something genuinely different within the Dragon Ball gaming space, and the multiplayer experience was engaging in the way that cooperative action games with friends tend to be engaging. The single-player content was considered thin, however, and the game's ambitions were not always matched by its execution. It remained a notable experiment in the ongoing project of defining what Dragon Ball games could be. Dragon Ball Xenoverse was released in 2015, and it was unlike any Dragon Ball game that had come before it. The concept at the center of Xenoverse was time. The game's story introduced the Toki Toki City, a hub world existing outside the normal flow of Dragon Ball's timeline, inhabited by time patrollers whose purpose was to prevent alterations to established history. The player took the role of a time patroller, a custom character of their own creation, who was dispatched into specific historical moments to defend those moments against interference. The custom character creation in Xenoverse was the most comprehensive the franchise had offered. Players could choose from 5 races: Saiyan, Human, Namekian, Majin, and the alien race known as Frieza's species. Each race had unique attributes. Saiyans received stat bonuses when their health dropped low. Namekians recovered stamina at an enhanced rate. Majin characters could share health with teammates. Frieza's species had the highest ki blast statistics. The choice of race was not cosmetic. It was a mechanical decision that shaped the character's identity throughout the experience. Each race also offered significant options for physical customization: body proportions, skin tone, facial features, hairstyle, and color. The character you built in Xenoverse was genuinely yours, in a way that Dragon Ball gaming had not previously enabled. Players shared their character designs with each other online, with the same investment that went into sharing characters in role-playing games. Comparing builds and aesthetics with the attention of people who had created something they cared about, the Time Patrol story took the custom character through missions set in key moments of Dragon Ball Z and Dragon Ball Super history, which were altered by antagonists known as the Time Breakers. These alterations were often slight but meaningful. Vegeta would receive assistance during his fight with Goku, or Frieza would not be defeated at the appointed moment, or a fusion that should not have occurred would take place. The custom character's role was to correct these deviations, which often meant fighting alongside the established characters while also fighting against the altered ones. This structure gave Xenoverse a narrative flexibility that earlier games had lacked, because the player character was an observer and corrector rather than the protagonist in their own right. The game could treat established Dragon Ball history with a kind of reverence while also departing from it when the story required. The most beloved moments of the franchise were present and essentially intact, but they existed within a frame that allowed the game to have its own story alongside them. Xenoverse's online functionality extended its life considerably beyond what its content volume alone would have supported. Players could team up with others to complete parallel quests, side missions that took place alongside the main timeline, offering additional challenges and rewards. The online hub filled with other players' custom characters, each one unique, each one representing someone else's imagination applied to the Dragon Ball universe. The game was a social space as much as it was a single-player experience. Dragon Ball Xenoverse 2 was released in 2016, and it built on its predecessor's foundation with a comprehensiveness that was immediately apparent. Content City, the hub of Xenoverse 2, was larger than Toki Toki City had been, significantly larger, a full three-dimensional environment divided into districts that could be explored on foot or by flight. The city was populated by hundreds of online players simultaneously, each represented by their custom character. Shops occupied specific buildings. Training areas were designated locations within the geography. The city was built to be lived in, visited repeatedly, navigated as a place rather than a menu. The story of Xenoverse 2 expanded on the time patrol concept by introducing additional antagonists and widening the scope of the timeline alterations being investigated. The game's story missions covered Dragon Ball Z, Dragon Ball Super, Dragon Ball GT, and the official films, providing a more complete tour through Dragon Ball history than the first game had managed. New characters were introduced as story mode figures, mentors who could be trained under, each one offering a different set of skills to learn. The mentor system was one of Xenoverse 2's most appreciated features. Players could choose to train under characters like Vegeta, Piccolo, Beerus, Whis, Hit, or others, and progress through a series of training missions that culminated in the mentor teaching the custom character their signature techniques. Training under Vegeta eventually provided access to his Gallic Gun and his Final Flash. Training under Piccolo eventually unlocked the Special Beam Cannon. The system made the relationships between the custom character and the established cast feel earned. You did not simply receive these techniques, you worked for them. Xenoverse 2 received an exceptionally long support period. Downloadable content continued to be released for years after the game's initial launch, adding new characters, new story missions, new costumes, and new features. Characters from Dragon Ball Super, including gods of destruction from universes other than Universes 11, members of the Pride Troopers from Universe 11, and fighters from the Tournament of Power, were added as the anime progressed and gave the game's developers new material to work with. The game's longevity established it as one of the defining Dragon Ball gaming experiences of its decade. Players who returned to it years after launch found a product that had grown considerably from what they had originally purchased, populated by a community that had remained invested across the same span of time. If you're still awake halfway through, maybe subscribe before you drift off, and tell me what time it is where you're watching from. Dragon Ball FighterZ was released in 2018, and it changed the conversation around Dragon Ball games in ways that extended beyond the franchise itself. The game was developed by Arc Systemworks, a studio known for the Guilty Gear and BlazBlue fighting game series, and the partnership produced a product unlike any Dragon Ball game that had come before. FighterZ was a 3-on-3 tag team fighter with a two-dimensional combat plane. Characters moved left and right, jumped and descended, executed attacks along the classic axis of a traditional fighting game. But the visual presentation was something else entirely. Arc Systemworks used a form of cell shading technology that had been developed and refined across their Guilty Gear series. And when applied to Dragon Ball's aesthetic, it produced results that were widely described as indistinguishable from the anime in motion. Character models moved with the exaggerated fluidity of hand-drawn animation. Energy blasts bloomed with the oversaturated color of the anime's best sequences. Super attacks were accompanied by dramatic camera shifts, extreme close-ups, and impact effects that recreated the visual grammar of Dragon Ball Z's most iconic moments with a precision that felt almost like preservation. The game's mechanical design was considered accessible to newcomers and deep enough for competitive play. The 3-on-3 structure encouraged experimentation with team compositions, which characters worked well together, whose assist attacks complemented whose offense, how to sequence the team for maximum effectiveness. The fighting game community received FighterZ with genuine enthusiasm, and the game appeared at major competitive events alongside the traditional pillars of the genre. FighterZ's story mode introduced Android 21, an original character created for the game with design input from Dragon Ball's original author, Akira Toriyama. Android 201 was a scientist-type character whose origin was connected to the existing Android storyline of Dragon Ball Z, and whose abilities placed her among the more powerful entities in the Dragon Ball universe. The story mode was structured around a soul possession mechanic that provided an in-universe explanation for why the player was controlling established characters, and it moved through a branching narrative across 3 chapters. The roster at launch was widely debated. Some felt it was smaller than a Dragon Ball game ought to be, and the distribution of characters was notably weighted toward Dragon Ball Z at the expense of the broader franchise. But the quality of every character included was unusually high. Each fighter moved distinctly. No 2 movesets felt repeated or recycled. The attention given to individual character design was evident in every frame. Post-launch downloadable content added characters over time, eventually bringing the roster to a size that included representation from Dragon Ball Super and the Dragon Ball Super Broly film. Gogeta, Super Saiyan Blue, Broly from the New Continuity, and Kefla from the Tournament of Power were among the additions that expanded the game's coverage beyond its initial Dragon Ball Z focus. FighterZ's cultural impact was felt across the fighting game space. It demonstrated that an anime-based fighting game could be designed with the same care and competitive seriousness as any traditional fighting game title, and it encouraged other developers to approach anime licenses with higher standards than had sometimes been applied previously. Dragon Ball Z Kakarot was released in 2020, and it represented the most ambitious attempt in the franchise's gaming history to tell the complete story of Dragon Ball Z in a single interactive experience. The game was developed by CyberConnect 2, a studio known for the Naruto Ultimate Ninja series, and it was structured as an action role-playing game, not a fighting game, but an adventure. Players explored 3-dimensional environments that represented the locations of Dragon Ball Z's story, moving between areas, engaging enemies in direct combat, collecting items, completing side quests, and progressing through a narrative that followed the full arc from the Saiyan saga to the end of the Buu saga. The environments in Kakarot were designed with a particular awareness of how Dragon Ball Z's world had been established across decades of animation. The rocky terrain around Kame House, the vast orange-skied wasteland where Goku and Vegeta first fought, the alien blue of Namek's ocean geography. Each location was built with the kind of detail that communicated genuine familiarity with the source material. The developers had clearly spent time with the anime, not just with reference documents. Combat in Kakarot was real-time rather than turn-based. The player controlled a single character at a time, switching between party members in certain scenarios, while AI-controlled allies participated in battle alongside the active character. The combat was kinetic and visually spectacular. Energy blasts and physical strikes were rendered with the same dramatic flair that FighterZ had shown was achievable, though Kakarot's combat was designed for accessibility rather than competitive depth. One of Kakarot's most discussed design choices was its approach to the story's downtime. Between battles, the game encouraged players to eat meals, prepared from ingredients gathered in the environment or purchased from vendors, that provided statistical bonuses to characters. These meals were shared at tables with other characters, and the scenes in which they occurred were quiet and warm. Goku eating ravenously while Chi-Chi expressed exasperation. Gohan studying while Piccolo waited outside the window, Vegeta training alone while the others rested. These small domestic scenes were not mandatory, but they were deeply rewarding for players who had spent years with these characters and appreciated glimpses of their lives outside the battles. The game's handling of the story's emotional moments was careful. Goku's sacrifice during the Cell Saga was rendered with appropriate gravity. Gohan's transformation against Cell was presented as the complete dramatic escalation the anime had intended it to be. The death of Vegeta at Frieza's hands on Namek and the moment of vulnerability and despair that preceded it were given the attention that event had always deserved. Kakarot treated the Dragon Ball Z story as material worth honoring rather than as a sequence of battle scenarios to provide context for fighting mechanics. Post-launch content for Kakarot included additional story episodes covering Dragon Ball Super material, the Battle of Gods and Resurrection F narratives, as well as an original story set during the Tournament of Power, extending the game's coverage and giving players who had completed the original content new reasons to return. While the main console Dragon Ball games were developing along the lines described, a separate corner of Dragon Ball gaming history was unfolding in Japanese arcades. Dragon Ball Heroes began as an arcade card game in 2010, using a system in which players build decks of cards and scan them into arcade cabinets to battle. The game was built on the concept of an alternate Dragon Ball universe, a kind of meta-narrative space in which characters from different eras and timelines could interact, where power levels exceeded anything the main continuity had established, and where entirely new transformations and character combinations could be introduced without concern for canonical consistency. The arcade game spawned an associated promotional anime series, Super Dragon Ball Heroes, that began airing in 2018 as a web series. This series adapted and expanded on the storylines being told in the arcade game, introducing concepts like the Prison Planet arc, the Space-Time War arc, and the Universe Creation Saga. Characters from Dragon Ball GT who had been largely absent from Dragon Ball Super, most notably Goku's Super Saiyan 4 transformation and the Ultra Instinct concept applied to alternate versions of familiar figures, appeared in the Heroes universe alongside Dragon Ball Super's cast. The Super Dragon Ball Heroes web series and its associated games operated in a space that was openly promotional. Each new episode was accompanied by new card releases, and the storyline served in part to introduce new game content. But the series also provided something that its audience genuinely valued, a space where the rules were loose enough to allow almost anything, where the question was always what would be the most spectacular combination, rather than what would fit within established narrative logic. For the portion of the Dragon Ball audience that valued spectacle and novelty above consistency, the Heroes franchise was precisely what they needed. Dragon Ball Legends was released in 2018 as a mobile fighting game for iOS and Android devices, and it represented the franchise's most ambitious entry into the mobile gaming space. The game was a card-based fighting game in which players assembled teams of characters represented by collectible cards with varying rarity tiers and statistical profiles. The combat itself was real-time, played on a vertical screen with characters moving along a horizontal plane, a design choice dictated by the single-handed orientation in which mobile games were often held. Players swiped cards to execute attacks, tapped to activate special moves, and managed a resource meter that governed how frequently powerful techniques could be used. Legends shared DNA with the collectible card game model. Assembling the most powerful available roster of cards was a central activity, and the game's gacha system through which new cards were obtained was a point of ongoing discussion among its player community. But the game also made meaningful efforts to provide rewarding story content. Original characters were introduced, most notably Shallot, a Saiyan of ancient origin whose involvement in the game's story drove its narrative forward across multiple seasons of content. The game's story brought characters together from across Dragon Ball's entire timeline, including characters from the original series, Z, Super, GT, and the official films. The visual quality of its cutscenes improved substantially over its lifespan, moving from static images to fully animated sequences with voice acting. By the early 2020s, Legends had established itself as the primary Dragon Ball gaming experience for players who engaged with the franchise primarily through mobile devices. Dragon Ball: The Breakers was released in 2022, and it occupied a position in the Dragon Ball gaming landscape that was genuinely unlike anything that had preceded it. The game was an asymmetric multiplayer experience. 7 players took the roles of ordinary civilians attempting to survive and escape from a temporal anomaly, while a single player took the role of a raider, controlling one of Dragon Ball Z's major antagonists at progressively increasing power levels. The raiders in the game's launch lineup included Cell, Frieza, and Boo, each one capable of growing from a baseline power level to their final forms as the match progressed, becoming more dangerous with each evolution. The civilian players had access to tools and vehicles drawn from the Dragon Ball universe, capsule technology, scouters, various machines, and could find power keys scattered through the environment that allowed them to temporarily transform into characters from Dragon Ball Z, gaining brief access to the kind of power needed to contest the Raiders' advances. The tone of the civilian side was one of survival strategy rather than heroism, ordinary people making difficult choices under extreme pressure. The concept drew comparisons to other asymmetric multiplayer games of the period, and the Dragon Ball context gave it a specific thematic resonance. The feeling of being an ordinary person in a world where gods and monsters exist, a theme implicit throughout Dragon Ball's storytelling, was made literal and playable. The Raiders' progression from vulnerability to overwhelming dominance recreated the narrative arc of Dragon Ball Z's major villains in mechanical form. Dragon Ball Sparking Zero was released in 2024, and it was received as the long-awaited spiritual successor to the Budokai Tenkaichi series that had last appeared with Budokai Tenkaichi 3 in 2007. The game was developed by Spike Chunsoft, the studio that had produced the original Tenkaichi series, and it carried forward the field-based combat philosophy of those games while updating every dimension of their presentation for the hardware of its era. The arenas were vast, destruction was comprehensive, mountains shattered, cliffs collapsed. The geometry of the environment responded to the force of combat in ways that made each fight feel like a geological event. The character roster was large, carrying the completionist spirit of the Tenkaichi series with the coverage of Dragon Ball Super material that the older games had not been able to offer. The combat in Sparking Zero maintained the third person behind the character perspective that the Tenkaichi series had established, with improvements to how clashes and counters functioned that made the exchanges feel more dynamic. Vanishing attacks, the technique of instantaneously repositioning during combat to catch opponents off guard, were faster and more dramatically presented than they had been in the Tenkaichi 3 era. Key blasts traveled with weight and intensity. The visual presentation of super attacks drew on the same aesthetic ambitions FighterZ had demonstrated, making the most powerful techniques genuinely spectacular to witness. The game included an episode battle mode that covered the stories of multiple characters across the Dragon Ball Super era, not merely Goku's perspective, but those of Vegeta, Broly, Gohan, and others. This multi-perspective approach acknowledged that the years since the Tenkaichi 3 era had added new central figures to the Dragon Ball cast, each with their own narrative threads worth exploring. Sparking Zero's release was received with considerable enthusiasm by the Dragon Ball gaming community, many of whom had waited nearly 2 decades for a direct successor to the Budokai Tenkaichi 3 experience. The game validated those years of patient anticipation. The games described so far represent the major landmarks in Dragon Ball gaming history, the titles that were widely released, widely played, and widely remembered. But the complete history of Dragon Ball games includes dozens of smaller entries that occupied specific niches, filled specific audiences. Dragon Ball Z: The Legend was released for the PlayStation and Sega Saturn in 1996, and it was a turn-based strategy game, a genre that Dragon Ball had rarely returned to. Players arranged teams of characters and directed their actions across multiple rounds of combat, with the outcomes of exchanges determined by numerical calculations. The game covered the Saiyan saga and portions of the Namek saga, and while it was not widely distributed in Western markets, it demonstrated that the Dragon Ball license could accommodate genres beyond the fighting game. Dragon Ball Z Sagas, released in 2005 for the PlayStation 2, GameCube, and Xbox, was a beat-em-up, a genre in which a single character or pair of characters moved through a level fighting multiple enemies simultaneously. The game covered the major sagas of Dragon Ball Z and could be played cooperatively by two players simultaneously. It was received with mixed reviews, largely on the grounds that its combat lacked the depth of the fighting games and its execution of the beat-em-up format was uneven. But it served as a cooperative Dragon Ball experience at a time when co-op Dragon Ball games were rare. Dragon Ball Z Harukanaru Goku Densetsu was released for the Nintendo DS in 2007. It was a card-based adventure game with a unique presentation. The player moved through the Dragon Ball Z story by selecting story branches, each represented by cards, while combat was resolved through a card game system that involved managing a hand of attack and defense options. The game's approach was imaginative and its execution was competent, but it remained a domestic Japanese release and was not widely known outside that market. These smaller entries are part of the complete picture. They represent the attempts, some successful, some less so, to find new ways of placing players inside the Dragon Ball universe. Not every experiment worked. Not every game justified the time it asked for, but each one reflected a genuine effort on the part of its creators to engage with the franchise in a way that felt appropriate to both the material and the format. One dimension of Dragon Ball gaming history that receives less attention than it deserves is the music. The Dragon Ball franchise has always had a strong musical identity. Shunsuke Kikuchi composed the original scores for Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z, producing music that was at once energetic and melodic. Themes that became so inseparable from specific moments and characters that hearing them decades later still carries immediate emotional association. The opening themes of the anime, the battle themes, the quieter character pieces, these compositions were part of what made Dragon Ball's world feel real and inhabited. When Dragon Ball games began incorporating music from the anime, they were doing more than adding audio to a product. They were invoking a whole context of memory and association. A player who heard the Dragon Ball Z opening theme in a game menu screen was not simply hearing a piece of music, they were being reminded of everything that piece of music had ever meant to them. Early Dragon Ball games were limited in how faithfully they could reproduce musical material by the hardware of their era. The Famicom's sound chip produced approximations of Kikuchi's melodies, recognizable in outline, simplified in texture. The Super Famicom handled music with greater nuance, and the shift to CD-based media on the PlayStation allowed for the inclusion of full orchestral recordings. Each hardware generation brought Dragon Ball's music closer to the experience of hearing it as it had originally been composed. The Budokai games introduced original compositions by Kenji Yamamoto, which were designed to complement the existing Dragon Ball Z musical identity while providing the games with their own distinct sonic character. Yamamoto's contributions to the Budokai series were well received, and several of his compositions, including the dramatic battle themes that played during the most intense fighting game encounters, became associated specifically with the gaming experience rather than with the anime. Later games engaged with music in increasingly sophisticated ways. Xenoverse 2 included an enormous library of tracks drawn from across Dragon Ball history, and FighterZ commissioned original compositions that matched the anime's dramatic intensity, while providing the kind of clean, rhythmically precise music that competitive fighting gameplay requires. Kakarot used music to define the emotional texture of each saga, transitioning from the expansive, hopeful themes of the world exploration segments to the darker, more urgent compositions that accompanied the story's most challenging moments. The voice performances in Dragon Ball games are another dimension of the experience that has shaped how players relate to the material. In Japan, the principal Dragon Ball Z cast has maintained remarkable consistency across the franchise's history. Masako Nozawa has voiced Goku from the beginning of the original Dragon Ball anime in 1986 through every subsequent series, and most of the major games. Her performance is the definition of Goku for the generation of Japanese audiences who grew up with the character. Its particular quality of earnest enthusiasm and limitless energy has been present across more than 35 years of Dragon Ball history. Ryo Horikawa has voiced Vegeta across the same span. His performance defines the character's arc from contemptuous antagonist to complicated ally. The coldness of early Vegeta and the complex pride of later Vegeta are products of the same fundamental performance, adjusted by degrees as the character developed across the story. Hearing Horikawa's Vegeta in a game set during the Saiyan saga provides a different emotional experience than hearing the same voice in a Dragon Ball Super context, because the accumulated history of the character adds weight to every scene. The English language Dragon Ball Z dub produced a separate performance tradition centered on the work of actors like Sean Schemmel, Christopher Sabat, and Stephanie Nadolny, the voices of Goku, Vegeta, and young Gohan respectively in the Funimation productions that introduced Dragon Ball Z to North American audiences in the late 1990s and early 2000s. The Budokai series and its successors incorporated these English performances, which meant that for the generation of Western players who encountered Dragon Ball Z through the dubbed television broadcasts, the games felt like direct extensions of the experience they already knew. The relationship between Dragon Ball's original creator and the video games produced under the franchise's name was complex and evolved over time. Akira Toriyama approached his work with a directness and practical honesty that was evident in how he described his own creative process. He created Dragon Ball as a serialized manga, generating new content under the pressure of weekly deadlines, and the games derived from that work were, from his perspective, separate products that other talented people were making. He maintained creative involvement in the franchise at the level of overall supervision and approval, rather than at the level of direct game design. And his contributions to specific games were typically limited to character designs and broad story guidance. The most notable exception to this general pattern was Dragon Ball FighterZ, for which Toriyama provided the character design for Android 2-1. The creation of a new character for a video game, one who would interact with the established Dragon Ball cast in a canonical way, represented a level of creative involvement that was unusual by the standards of how Toriyama typically engaged with the games. Android 21's design was received positively by the Dragon Ball audience, and her inclusion in FighterZ was one of the factors that made the game feel like something more than a licensed product. Toriyama also contributed to Dragon Ball Xenoverse and its sequel through character designs for the new figures that populated those games' original story content. The Time Patrol organization, the antagonists known as the Time Breakers, and the various new fighters introduced across the Xenoverse games were developed with his input. This collaboration between the game's development team at DIMPS and Toriyama's studio Bird Studio produced designs that felt coherent with the Dragon Ball visual aesthetic, while also reflecting the particular requirements of interactive media. The awareness of Toriyama's presence in the background of the franchise, even in products he had not directly shaped, gave the Dragon Ball gaming catalog a kind of authorial coherence that was unusual for a franchise of its size and age. His aesthetic sensibility, his particular approach to character design, his comfort with mixing earnest drama with moments of absurdist humor, these qualities permeated the games even when he was not directly involved, because they had permeated the source material from which the games drew. Dragon Ball games have produced multiple distinct competitive communities across their history. The Budokai series supported an early competitive community in the mid-2000s, with regional and national tournaments organized around Budokai 2 and especially Budokai 3. The capsule customization system created an interesting dimension of competitive preparation. Knowing which capsule configurations were optimal and which combinations were most effective against particular opponents was a separate skill from the moment-to-moment execution of combat. Tournament participants had to develop both dimensions of their game, which created a competitive meta that was richer than pure execution-based fighting games typically produced. The Budokai Tenkaichi series, with its larger arenas and freer movement, produced a different competitive context. The field-based combat created situations in which spacing, prediction, and pursuit were more central than in the confined arenas of the Budokai games. The large rosters of Tenkaichi 2 and Tenkaichi 3 created a character selection layer of significant complexity. Knowing which characters were strong in the competitive context and why required extensive experimentation and knowledge sharing within the community. Dragon Ball FighterZ's competitive scene was the most prominent the franchise had ever produced. The game was featured at Evolution Championship Series, the largest annual fighting game tournament, and attracted players from other fighting game communities who were drawn to the quality of its mechanics. Top players who had built reputations in games like Street Fighter V and Tekken 7 competed in FighterZ, raising the level of play and giving the game competitive credibility that extended Dragon Ball's presence in the broader fighting game conversation. The competitive scenes around Dragon Ball games have always been communities of genuine passion. The players who organize tournaments, create guides, share combo videos, and maintain active discussion forums do so because they care about these games specifically, not because Dragon Ball games are the most prestigious fighting games available, but because they are the fighting games that contain the characters and worlds that matter to them. The history of Dragon Ball games exists not only in software but in the physical objects that have accumulated around it. Game cartridges for the earliest Dragon Ball titles, the Super Cassette Vision game, the Famicom RPGs, the Super Famicom Fighters, are physical artifacts of a specific moment in gaming history. They exist in limited quantities, and those quantities have diminished over the decades as cartridges deteriorate, are lost, or are kept in collections rather than circulated. The most obscure of these early releases are genuinely rare, and finding playable examples in good condition requires patience and resources. The Datax barcode cards from Dragon Ball Z, Gecko, Tenkaichi Budokai occupy a unique position in Dragon Ball collecting. The cards are the game in a fundamental sense. Without them, the game's cabinet cannot function. Collectors who pursue the data tax system must acquire both the hardware and the cards, and the cards were distributed through means that made complete sets difficult to assemble even when new. Decades later, complete data card collections for any game in the system are genuinely uncommon. The physical media of Dragon Ball games has also included a wide range of peripheral items, strategy guides published alongside game releases, promotional materials distributed at retail, limited edition packaging produced for specific regional markets, and the various accessory items that accompanied certain hardware releases. These materials form a parallel documentary history of Dragon Ball gaming, paper evidence of how the games were marketed, described, and sold across different eras and in different countries. There is a kind of knowledge that comes from engaging with something across a long span of time, not just knowing the facts, but understanding how all the facts connect. The complete history of Dragon Ball video games is the history of a franchise learning what it is, repeatedly across nearly 4 decades of experimentation. It is the history of developers asking how to translate the energy of a manga panel into something a player can hold and act within. It is the history of technologies changing and making new things possible, and of artists and programmers using those possibilities to bring a world closer to the experience of the person engaging with it. The first Dragon Ball game, that small shooter on the Super Cassette Vision, had almost nothing of what Dragon Ball games would eventually become. The characters were recognizable, the music was present, the basic premise was in place, but the depth of the fighting games, the expansiveness of the role-playing games, the social possibilities of the multiplayer experiences, the creative freedom of the character creation systems, none of that existed yet. It all had to be found, one game at a time, across decades of effort. Each generation of Dragon Ball games added something to the cumulative understanding of what these games could be. The Budokai series established that Dragon Ball fighting games could be mechanically serious. The Tenkaichi series established that they could be comprehensively inclusive. FighterZ established that they could be visually transcendent. Xenoverse established that they could be personal. Kakarot established that they could be emotionally complete. Each of these contributions built on what came before and made possible what came after. The audience for Dragon Ball games has also accumulated something across that same span of time. Players who encountered the franchise through the early Famicom games are now in their 40s. Players whose first Dragon Ball game was a Budokai title are in their 30s. Players who came to the franchise through Xenoverse or FighterZ are still in their 20s. Each generation arrived at a different point in the franchise's history, found a different entry point, and carries a different set of memories. But all of them are part of the same long story. The story of people who found something in Dragon Ball's world that they wanted to spend time inside. The games have preserved that world in a particular way. The anime moves forward and then ends. The manga is completed and remains. But the games continue to be made, and in being made they continue to offer new ways of inhabiting the world that Akira Toriyama created in 1984, ways of feeling, even briefly, what it might be like to stand in that world and act within it. That is not nothing. In the long accounting of what Dragon Ball has meant to the people who have followed it, the games occupy a space that no other medium quite fills. They are where the story becomes interactive. They are where the audience becomes, for a moment, a participant. And that participation, quiet, earnest, often imperfect, always sincere, is part of what makes the complete history of Dragon Ball games something worth carrying with you into sleep. Dragon Ball GT occupies a particular position in Dragon Ball's history, a continuation of the animated story that ran from 1996 to 1997. Produced without the direct story involvement of Akira Toriyama, who provided only character designs and general supervision, the series was divisive among fans from the moment of its broadcast, and that divisiveness extended into the games that drew from its content. GT introduced a number of new concepts that the games found ways to work with. The Black Star Dragon Balls arc sent Goku, Trunks, and Pan across the universe in search of scattered Dragon Balls. The Baby arc introduced a Tofu parasite whose ability to possess hosts created a unique kind of antagonist. The Super Android 17 arc returned 2 android villains from Dragon Ball Z in an altered form, and the Shadow Dragon arc, the final portion of GT, transformed the franchise's central magical artifacts into malevolent entities, each one embodying the negative energy accumulated from decades of wish-making. The Shadow Dragons were among the more interesting antagonist concepts in Dragon Ball's larger mythology. Each of the 7 Shadow Dragons embodied a specific wish that had been made on the Dragon Balls, and their visual designs reflected those origins. Nuova Shenron, the 4-star dragon, moved with a precise dignity. Omega Shenron, the fusion of all 7 Shadow Dragons into a single entity, was presented as an existential threat beyond anything the franchise had previously depicted. The concept was dark by Dragon Ball's usual standards, a reckoning for the consequences of the magical system that had defined the franchise since its beginning. Games that incorporated GT content, including Budokai Tenkaichi 2 and Budokai Tenkaichi 3, as well as Dragon Ball GT Final Bout and several of the Xenoverse titles, engaged with these concepts with varying degrees of depth. The Budokai Tenkaichi games were the most comprehensive in their GT coverage, including not only the final form versions of the Shadow Dragons, but the intermediate forms, the possessed versions of established characters, and the GT-specific transformations, like Super Saiyan 4 and Baby Vegeta's various stages. Super Saiyan 4 was one of GT's most visually distinctive contributions to Dragon Ball mythology. The transformation gave Goku and Vegeta a design that was markedly different from the Super Saiyan forms they had achieved in Dragon Ball Z. Dark red fur, a longer-haired appearance, a wild and primal quality that contrasted with the cleaner, more controlled look of the standard Super Saiyan transformations. In games, Super Saiyan 4 became one of the most requested transformations for inclusion, a visual landmark that players wanted to see rendered in whatever graphical fidelity the current hardware allowed. Dragon Ball Super began airing in 2015, and its arrival created new material for Dragon Ball games to work with, at a time when the gaming franchise was in one of its most productive periods. The Battle of Gods arc introduced Beerus, the god of destruction of Universe 7, and his attendant and martial arts teacher Whis. These characters carried an aesthetic entirely new to Dragon Ball. Beerus was designed as a lean, cat-like figure whose movements conveyed an effortless, sleepy authority, while Whis was tall and androgynous, his power conveyed through absolute calmness rather than muscular intensity. Both characters appeared in games quickly after their introduction, and their fighting styles were designed to reflect the particular quality of beings who existed at a level of power fundamentally beyond the established Dragon Ball Z cast. The concept of God Ki, the divine energy that distinguished Beerus, Whis, and eventually the Super Saiyan God and Super Saiyan Blue forms of Goku and Vegeta, introduced a new axis of power to the Dragon Ball universe. Games that incorporated super content needed to accommodate this new tier while maintaining meaningful relationships between all the characters in their rosters. The challenge was one of balance as much as design. How to make Beerus feel appropriately overwhelming when fighting characters from earlier in Dragon Ball's timeline, while also making those characters feel relevant within their own story contexts. The Universal Survival Saga, which ran through 2017 and 2018 and culminated in the Tournament of Power, was arguably Dragon Ball Super's most significant contribution to the broader franchise mythology. The tournament gathered 80 warriors from 8 of the 12 universes to compete in a battle royal format, with the losing universes erased from existence. The stakes were unprecedented. The cast of combatants was the largest single gathering of named characters the franchise had ever assembled. For Dragon Ball games, the Tournament of Power was an extraordinarily rich source of material. The tournament's 80 fighters came from wildly varied backgrounds. Universe 11's Pride Troopers brought a team with a heroic identity and considerable power. Universe 6's team included Saiyans who had developed differently from their Universe 7th counterparts. Various other universes contributed fighters with unique abilities and design philosophies. Characters like Jiren, whose power exceeded that of a god of destruction, and Kefla, a fusion of 2 Saiyan women from Universe 6, became significant additions to game rosters. Dragon Ball Super Broly, released as a theatrical film in 2018, introduced a canonical version of Broly, a character who had previously appeared in 3 non-canonical Dragon Ball Z films and had built an enormous fanbase through those appearances, despite not existing within the official Dragon Ball storyline. The original non-canonical Broly, introduced in the 1993 film Dragon Ball Z, Broly the Legendary Super Saiyan, was a Saiyan of extraordinary power whose hatred of Goku, rooted in a memory of Goku crying as an infant in the same nursery, drove him toward destructive single-mindedness. The character's design was imposing, and his power level was presented as genuinely beyond anything the Dragon Ball Z cast had encountered. He appeared in 2 further non-canonical films and became a fixture in Dragon Ball game rosters, a fan-demanded presence that game developers understood carried significant audience appeal. The canonical Broly of Dragon Ball Super Broly was a substantially different character, written by Akira Toriyama himself. This version of Broly retained the physical presence and extraordinary power of the non-canonical version, but replaced the single-minded rage with a more complex emotional profile. This Broly had been exiled from planet Vegeta as an infant by King Vegeta, who feared the child's potential. He had survived with his father Paragus on a harsh planet for decades, his power growing without proper development or understanding. When he encountered Goku and Vegeta on Earth, the conflict was less about hatred and more about an enormous force finding itself in a situation it could not fully process. The canonical Broly's redesign was received as one of Toriyama's more thoughtful character reimaginings, a figure whose danger came from raw power and inadequate control, rather than from malice, whose story carried genuine tragedy. Games that incorporated the canonical Broly, including Dragon Ball FighterZ, which added him as downloadable content, worked with this more nuanced characterization rather than defaulting to the pure destructive energy of the non-canonical version. The distinction was meaningful to players who had followed both versions of the character across the years. No account of Dragon Ball gaming history is complete without acknowledging the communities that formed around these games and shaped how they were experienced. The Dragon Ball gaming community has been active across multiple platforms across multiple decades. In the early years of internet message boards and gaming forums, players shared guides, strategies, and experiences with games that had no official walkthroughs or FAQs. The question of how to unlock specific characters in Budokai or how to navigate the more difficult challenge modes in Budokai Tenkaichi was answered not by official documentation, but by the collective knowledge of players who had spent time with the games and wanted to share what they had found. Video content documenting Dragon Ball games arrived with the growth of video sharing platforms in the mid-2000s. And the scope of Dragon Ball gaming documentation that accumulated across the following decade and a half was remarkable. Players created complete playthroughs of every major title, frame-by-frame analyses of fighting game mechanics, tier lists that ranked the competitive viability of characters across different games, and retrospective essays that placed individual games within the larger history of the franchise. The accumulated video documentation of Dragon Ball gaming is itself a kind of living archive, an ongoing record of how people have related to these games across time. The speedrunning community found specific Dragon Ball games particularly interesting as subjects for their particular kind of optimized play. Dragon Ball Z Kakarot, with its open world and large volume of optional content, attracted runners who found ways to navigate its story with a degree of efficiency that the game's designers had not anticipated. Dragon Ball Xenoverse and its sequel attracted runners who developed deep knowledge of how the game's systems could be exploited to progress through missions faster than intended. Each speedrunning community around each Dragon Ball game represented a form of very deep engagement with that game's mechanical systems, an understanding achieved through hundreds or thousands of hours of focused attention. The fan translation community also played a role in Dragon Ball gaming history, particularly in the early period when many Japanese Dragon Ball titles had not received English language releases. Games like Dragon Ball Z, Super Saiyan Densetsu, and various other Famicom and Super Famicom releases were translated into English by volunteers who had both the linguistic skills and the technical knowledge to modify game ROMs. Replacing Japanese text with English equivalents, these translations made the games accessible to a Western audience that would otherwise have had no means of engaging with them, and they were products of genuine labor and affection for the material. The development of Dragon Ball games has involved a relatively consistent set of studios across the franchise's history, and the work these studios have done reflects the particular challenges of adapting one of the world's most distinctive visual aesthetics into interactive form. DIMPS, founded in 2000 in Osaka, was responsible for the original Budokai series and Burst Limit. The studio brought experience with fighting game development to the Dragon Ball license and produced games that combined accessibility with genuine mechanical depth. DIMPS's approach to Dragon Ball combat emphasized responsiveness, the feeling of inputs translating immediately and satisfyingly into on-screen actions, which gave the Budokai series a different quality of physical engagement than the heavier, more momentum-based combat of the Tenkaichi games. Spike Chunsoft, the studio responsible for the Budokai Tenkaichi series, approached Dragon Ball games with a different set of priorities. Their focus was on scale, on creating fighting game environments large enough to accommodate the kind of world-spanning aerial combat the anime depicted, and on assembling rosters comprehensive enough to satisfy the most devoted fans of the franchise. The technical achievement of rendering 160 playable characters in Budokai Tenkaichi 3, each with unique movesets and animations, represented an enormous production effort that is sometimes underappreciated in discussions of that game's legacy. CyberConnect 2, the developer of Kakarot, brought to Dragon Ball the same craft they had demonstrated in the Naruto gaming series. an ability to translate an anime's visual and emotional language into a role-playing game format that honored the source material without reducing it to a fighting game framework. Their decision to build Kakarot as an open-world exploration game rather than as a fighting game was a deliberate, artistic choice, and the result demonstrated that the Dragon Ball license had storytelling possibilities that the fighting game format had always left on the table. Arc System Works' contribution with FighterZ demonstrated that the visual quality achievable in Dragon Ball games had not yet been fully explored. The studio's proprietary cell shading technology applied to Dragon Ball's character designs with a meticulous attention to the franchise's visual vocabulary produced a result that was genuinely new. Not just a very good-looking game, but a game whose appearance constituted its own argument about what Dragon Ball deserved. Dragon Ball games have occupied a specific position within Japanese gaming culture that is worth understanding on its own terms. In Japan, Dragon Ball has been a mainstream cultural presence since the mid-1980s, decades longer than in most Western markets. The franchise's games were therefore developed for an audience that had grown up with Dragon Ball as part of the fabric of everyday popular culture, in the same way that Western audiences grew up with certain films or television programs as ambient cultural references. Japanese players who encountered the first Dragon Ball Famicom games in 1986 were not discovering an unfamiliar property. They were interacting with characters and stories they already knew and cared about. This depth of cultural familiarity shaped how Japanese Dragon Ball games were designed. Developers could assume knowledge of the source material that Western developers could not assume from Western audiences. Story modes could reference character relationships and established events without explanation. The humor of certain character interactions, Piccolo's reluctant involvement in domestic Dragon Ball scenarios, the particular dynamic between Goku and Vegeta, could be played for knowing appreciation rather than needing to be established from scratch. The Japanese arcade scene provided Dragon Ball games with a persistent physical presence that console and handheld games did not. Arcade centers, game centers in the Japanese usage, were distributed throughout Japanese cities, accessible after school and on weekends, embedded in the rhythm of daily life in a way that console games required television access to replicate. Dragon Ball arcade games were therefore part of a social experience, played in public, sometimes with crowds watching, sometimes in direct competition with other players at adjacent cabinets. This social dimension was particularly pronounced during the Dragon Ball Heroes era, when the card game aspect encouraged players to visit game centers regularly to scan new cards and compare collections. The story of Dragon Ball games in Western markets, North America and Europe, is a story of delayed arrival, cultural context building, and eventual full integration. The earliest Dragon Ball games to receive official Western releases did so without the benefit of the franchise's anime presence. Dragon Power, the North American version of Dragon Ball Shenron no Nazo, arrived in 1988 to an audience that had no connection to the material it represented. Dragon Ball GT Final Bout arrived in North America in 1997 in very limited quantities, just as Dragon Ball Z was beginning to build a Western audience through home video releases. The Budokai series was the turning point. Its North American release in 2002 coincided with Dragon Ball Z's extensive run on Cartoon Network, which had introduced the franchise to a generation of Western viewers in the early 2000s. Players who had been watching Dragon Ball Z after school or on weekend mornings found in Budokai a game that spoke directly to their experience of the franchise, the same characters, the same voice actors, the same story beats they had been following on television. The games and the television broadcast created a mutually reinforcing engagement with the material. European Dragon Ball gaming had its own distinct trajectory. France in particular had developed a large and devoted Dragon Ball audience in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and French publishers had made the franchise available in ways that were not simultaneously occurring in North America. French players therefore had access to Super Famicom-era Dragon Ball Z games that North American players did not. and the French Dragon Ball gaming community carried a different historical depth than its North American counterpart. The integration of Dragon Ball games into the mainstream Western gaming market that occurred through the Budokai and Tenkaichi eras established the franchise as a consistent and commercially significant presence in Western game retail. Publishers and retailers came to understand that new Dragon Ball game releases could be expected to perform strongly, which gave developers the commercial security to invest in higher quality productions. The cycle of commercial success enabling higher quality production, enabling further commercial success, has characterized Dragon Ball gaming in Western markets for the past 2 decades. Every Dragon Ball game that has been released was, at the moment of its announcement, the future of the franchise's gaming history. And then it arrived and became the present, and then receded into the past, into the catalog that now stretches across nearly 4 decades. Looking at the complete arc of Dragon Ball gaming history, certain patterns emerge with a clarity that only distance can provide. The franchise has always found its most resonant gaming experiences in the fighting game format, not exclusively, but most consistently. The identity of Dragon Ball is bound up in combat, in the confrontation of specific characters at specific moments of their power, and the fighting game is the format that makes those confrontations directly playable rather than narratively mediated. But the franchise has also found meaningful experiences in every other format it has visited. The RPGs of the Famicom era provided emotional depth that the fighting games could not. The adventure and exploration of Kakarot provided a sense of inhabiting the Dragon Ball world that no fighting game fully replicates. The social and creative dimensions of Xenoverse provided a kind of personal investment in the Dragon Ball universe that is unique to those games. Each format has contributed something to the cumulative understanding of what Dragon Ball in interactive form can mean. The games that will come after the current moment are already being imagined. Developers are looking at the hardware being built and asking what Dragon Ball experiences it will make possible. They are looking at the stories that Dragon Ball Super is telling and asking how those stories can be given interactive form. They are looking at the fans who have grown up with every generation of Dragon Ball games and asking what those fans will want to find in the next one. Whatever those games turn out to be, they will carry the weight of everything that came before them. The first shooter on the Super Cassette Vision, the patient Famicom RPGs, the Super Famicom Fighters, the barcode scanning curiosity of the data system, the PlayStation experiments, the Budokai series and its fights, the Tenkaichi rosters and their completionism, FighterZ and its beauty, Xenoverse and its personal dimensions, Kakarot and its emotional honesty, Sparking Zero and its return to scale. Each of those games is part of the same long, quiet conversation, the conversation between the people who made Dragon Ball and the people who wanted to live inside it. That conversation is not finished. It continues in every new game, in every new player who finds the franchise for the first time, in every longtime fan who returns to a game they know well and finds in it something they had not noticed before. The history of Dragon Ball games is not a completed document. It is a living one, still being written, still growing outward from that first moment in 1984 when a cartoonist in Japan drew a young boy with a tail and put a flying cloud under his feet and sent him out into a world where adventure was. Always one more road ahead. Tonight, that road continues. And somewhere, right now, someone is playing a Dragon Ball game for the very first time, finding the franchise at whatever point in its history they have arrived. Not knowing yet how deep the roots go, how far back the story extends, how many games preceded the one in their hands, they will find out in time. The history is patient. It has been here all along. There is a particular quality to returning to a Dragon Ball game you played in a different part of your life. The game itself has not changed. The mechanics are the same, the roster is the same, the music is the same, but you have changed, you have grown, and the years between your first encounter with the game and your return to it have accumulated experience and perspective that you did not have before. The game that you once played as a product of the moment becomes, upon return, a document of a moment, evidence of what Dragon Ball was at a particular point in its development, and evidence of what you were at a particular point in yours. Players who return to the original Budokai games after years away often note how different the experience is from memory. The games are smaller than they remember, the rosters shorter, the environments fewer, the content volume more modest than the accumulated years of memory had suggested. But they are also more personal than expected. The particular sound of the Budokai menu music, the particular weight of those early Dragon Ball Z fights, the particular way that the game's story mode recreated scenes that the player had watched on television, these details carry emotional associations that have only deepened with time. The same phenomenon applies across the Dragon Ball gaming catalog. The Budokai Tenkaichi games, returned to after years with the more polished productions of later eras, reveal their age in their animations and their textures, while also revealing something that later games sometimes replicate but rarely surpass: a directness, an earnestness, a commitment to the idea that the goal of a Dragon Ball game is to let you be a Dragon Ball character in a Dragon Ball world, without ornamentation or apology. Older Dragon Ball games carry the history of the franchise's development as context. Playing Dragon Ball GT Final Bout in 2024 provides a different experience than it did in 1997, because the years between those dates have populated the surrounding territory with enough comparative material to place it clearly in a historical position. It is not simply a rough early game. It is the first fully three-dimensional Dragon Ball game, the first attempt to render these characters in a form that the Tenkaichi and Budokai and FighterZ artists would eventually perfect. Its roughness is historical information, not just aesthetic limitation. One of the reasons Dragon Ball games have always carried a particular visual identity is that the anime they drew from established a visual vocabulary so specific and so consistent that developers had a clear target to aim for, and the history of Dragon Ball gaming is, in part, the history of successive generations of hardware and artistry gradually closing the gap between that target and what technology could achieve. The original Dragon Ball anime, produced by Toei Animation and first broadcast in Japan in 1986, established the color palette and character proportions that all Dragon Ball visual media would reference. Goku's orange gi, Bulma's changing but always vibrant outfits, the particular warm quality of the Dragon Ball world's light. These were set in the earliest episodes and maintained across decades. The character designs drawn by Akira Toriyama in the manga were translated into animation with a consistency that spoke to how closely supervised that translation was. Dragon Ball Z, which began in 1989, shifted the visual tone considerably. The color palette deepened, the stakes in the story grew larger, the bodies of the characters became more muscular, the expressions more intense, the environments more varied and more frequently destructive. The animation quality varied episode to episode, a natural consequence of the production pressures of weekly broadcast animation, but at its best, Dragon Ball Z's animation was striking in ways that set a specific visual benchmark. The most celebrated sequences in Dragon Ball Z's animation history became the images that game developers most often tried to recreate. Goku's first Super Saiyan transformation on Namek, the golden aura spreading from within, the hair rising, the eyes shifting from black to blue-green, was a visual moment so precisely composed that it became a kind of test for Dragon Ball games. Could the game capture that specific combination of elements? Could it render the aura with the right kind of shimmer, the hair with the right kind of lift, the eyes with the right quality of cold, focused light? The answer changed with each hardware generation. The Super Famicom could suggest the transformation. The PlayStation could render it more fully. The PlayStation 2 could give it genuine weight. The PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 could approximate the animated original closely enough that the gap became a matter of degree rather than kind. FighterZ in 2018 effectively closed that gap, at least for the purposes of still images and short animated sequences. What had been a visual aspiration for 30 years had become achievable. The Dragon Ball Super anime added new visual benchmarks to the catalog. The Ultra Instinct transformation, Goku's silver-haired, transcendent state first achieved during the Tournament of Power, was animated with a particular quality of stillness, a controlled economy of movement that communicated effortless power more effectively than muscular exertion could have. Games that incorporated Ultra Instinct had to solve the problem of representing that specific quality of movement in interactive form, where the player was not watching Goku move, but actively directing his movements. The solutions varied, but each one represented an attempt to translate a visual and philosophical concept into the necessarily cruder vocabulary of real-time game action. Dragon Ball's antagonists have always been among its most vivid characters, and the games have given those antagonists interactive lives that extend and sometimes deepen the impressions made by the anime. Frieza is perhaps the franchise's most iconic villain, and his career in Dragon Ball games spans every era of the medium's development. He appeared in fighting games as early as the Super Famicom era, his 4 forms each representing a distinct power level and visual design, the regal first form giving way to the more powerful second and third forms, and finally to the elegant, refined final form that the anime presented as the most dangerous shape his power could take. What games make possible that the anime could not was the sustained experience of Frieza as an opponent. In the anime, Frieza's confrontation with Goku on Namek occupied many episodes, but the viewing experience was continuous and predetermined. In a fighting game, the player could face Frieza repeatedly, could learn his patterns, could develop counters, could feel the accumulation of skill that eventually translated into victory. The emotional arc of Goku's relationship with Frieza, the sense of facing something genuinely superior and finding a way through, could be personally experienced rather than merely witnessed. Cell brought a different quality to Dragon Ball's villain catalog. His methodical approach to absorbing androids 17 and 18 to reach his perfect form, his creation of the Cell games as a theatrical display of confidence, his particular combination of intelligence and cruelty, all of these qualities translated into fighting game character design in ways that made him feel different from the purely power-based antagonists that preceded him. Cell in Budokai 3 and Budokai Tenkaichi 3 moved with a quality of calculated precision that reflected his characterization in the anime, a controlled elegance that stood in contrast to the raw aggression of the Saiyan villains. Majin Buu presented the games with a different kind of challenge. The Buu arc of Dragon Ball Z introduced multiple forms of Buu: the rotund, childlike Fat Buu, the more dangerous Super Buu after absorbing other characters, and Kid Buu, the original pure form of the character that was simultaneously the most dangerous and the most instinctual. Games that included the full range of Buu forms had to distinguish between these versions mechanically, making each one feel like a different type of fight. Fat Buu's unpredictability and the surreal quality of his power, his ability to transform people into candy, his apparent imperviousness to conventional damage, had to be communicated through systems that were fundamentally based on conventional damage models. Beerus, the god of destruction introduced in Dragon Ball Super, brought a quality of restraint to the villain, or more precisely, the antagonist, since Beerus eventually became a grudging member of the series' extended family rather than a pure villain. His fighting game's appearance in Xenoverse and FighterZ required communicating the idea that this character was not trying very hard and was still overwhelmingly powerful, which is a mechanically unusual requirement. The solution in most games was to give Beerus attacks with an unusual quality of casual devastation, quick, almost lazy in their execution, but carrying damage values that reflected the gap in power between him and the established cast. Jiren, introduced during the Tournament of Power, represented Dragon Ball Super's answer to the question of what overwhelming power looks like when it is not associated with cruelty or evil. Jiren was not a villain, he was an opponent, a man whose commitment to individual strength had isolated him from the kind of bonds that the Dragon Ball narrative typically presents as the source of its hero's greatest power. His fighting games version had to carry this philosophical weight in its appearance and mechanics, conveying through posture and movement and attack animation the idea of a character who was less a person than a principle. Dragon Ball's supporting cast, the characters who were not the central focus of the story's major confrontations, but who populated its world and gave it warmth, have had a quiet but significant presence in Dragon Ball games across the decades. Krillin has always been one of Dragon Ball's most interesting supporting characters in gaming contexts. He is consistently present in the rosters of Dragon Ball fighting games, and his fighting style, centered on the Destructo Disc and the solar flare and the speed and technique that compensate for his lack of raw power, translates into fighting game mechanics with particular clarity. A well-designed Krillin in a Dragon Ball fighting game feels like a specific kind of challenge, not the overwhelming force of Goku or Vegeta, but a precise and strategic approach to combat that rewards players who learn his tools. Gohan's presence in Dragon Ball games is complicated by the multiple distinct versions of the character across his story arc. Child Gohan at the beginning of Dragon Ball Z, Teenage Gohan at the time of the Cell games, Adult Gohan in the Buu saga, and the various powered-up versions of each, including the legendary rage-fueled transformation against Cell that has become one of the franchise's most iconic moments, are all meaningfully different characters sharing the same identity. Games that include multiple Gohan versions are making a statement about the importance of that arc to Dragon Ball's story, and the care given to each version's design reflects how seriously the developers treat the character's journey. Piccolo's evolution from antagonist to mentor to something like family is one of Dragon Ball's most quietly affecting long-term character developments, and it is reflected in how Piccolo appears across games from different eras. In a game set during the Saiyan saga, Piccolo is an uneasy ally, and that quality can be communicated through story mode presentation. In a game set during the Buu saga, Piccolo is something else, a character whose relationship with the San family has accumulated into genuine affection that he would never articulate directly. The same model appears in both contexts, but the context changes everything. Trunks, both the future version who first appeared at the beginning of the Android saga and the child version who appeared later, occupies a unique position in Dragon Ball gaming, because the future version's backstory is one of the franchise's most emotionally resonant concepts. Future Trunks came from a timeline in which Goku had died of a heart virus before the androids appeared, in which Vegeta and the other Z fighters had been killed, in which only Trunks and his mentor Gohan survived. The game Dragon Ball Xenoverse 2 gave future Trunks a central narrative role that allowed this backstory to be explored with some depth, treating the character not merely as a cool addition to the roster, but as someone whose past carried genuine weight. For many players, especially those who encountered Dragon Ball through Western markets in the early 2000s, the games were not supplements to an existing knowledge of the franchise, they were the entry point. A player who picked up Dragon Ball Z Budokai in 2002 without prior experience of the anime would have found the game's story mode to be their first significant exposure to the Dragon Ball Z narrative. They would have learned who Raditz was and why his arrival mattered. They would have witnessed Goku's sacrifice and been uncertain how the story continued. They would have understood, through the game's presentation of the Cell saga, that Gohan's potential had always been remarkable and that its expression was something the story had been building toward from the beginning. This function of Dragon Ball games as narrative introduction is worth taking seriously. The games were not merely entertainment for existing fans, they were also, for many players, the gateway through which they became fans. The quality of the story mode presentation in a Dragon Ball game therefore had consequences beyond the immediate experience of playing it. A player who was moved by the Budokai 3 version of Goku's Cell Saga storyline was more likely to seek out the anime to invest in the characters further, to become the kind of devoted fan who would eventually play every game the franchise offered. The games also taught players about the mechanics and hierarchy of Dragon Ball's power system, a system that is more complex and sometimes less consistent than casual familiarity with the franchise might suggest. Understanding that the Super Saiyan multiplied a Saiyan's base power by a factor of 50, that Super Saiyan 2 doubled that again, that Super Saiyan 3 doubled it further while consuming enormous amounts of energy. This kind of knowledge was communicated through the games in ways that the anime sometimes left implicit. In a fighting game, power levels were made concrete through the relative damage values and health pools of different character versions, which provided a mechanical grounding for what the anime expressed through dramatic presentation. The translation of Dragon Ball games for Western markets has a history of its own, a history of choices made under time pressure with varying amounts of source material familiarity. For audiences whose relationship with the franchise was still developing, the early Dragon Ball game localizations were sometimes rough. Dragon Power's transformation of the original Famicom game was the most extreme example, the complete removal of Dragon Ball's identity from a product that was fundamentally inseparable from it. But subtler translation choices across later games also shaped how Western players understood the franchise. The question of character name transliterations was a recurring issue. The games used the English name conventions established by official releases, which meant that the same character might appear under different names in different regional versions of the same game. The decisions made about whether to use the Funimation dub names or the more literal transliterations of the Japanese originals were not always consistent across the catalog, and players who moved between Japanese-sourced information and English-language game presentations sometimes encountered confusing discrepancies. The voice acting in Western Dragon Ball game releases was for many years a complicated matter. The Budokai series used the Funimation English dubcast, which was what North American audiences had come to associate with the characters through the Cartoon Network broadcasts. The quality of that voice acting in the game context was generally considered to match the quality of the television dub, which meant it was familiar and reliable without always being exceptional. Later games improved both the recording quality and the performance direction, and by the time of Dragon Ball FighterZ and Dragon Ball Z, Kakarot, the English voice performances in the games were considered on par with any other format. The subtitling and localization of text in Dragon Ball games, the menus, the story mode dialogue, the item descriptions, the character profiles, was also a dimension of the experience that improved considerably over the franchise's gaming history. Early localizations sometimes rendered the specific texture of Dragon Ball's writing, its particular blend of earnest adventure, absurdist humor, and surprising emotional depth, less effectively than later ones did. The later games benefited from both the larger English-language Dragon Ball audience that could provide quality feedback, and from the institutional knowledge accumulated by teams who had worked on the franchises. Localization for many years. Across the history of Dragon Ball games, a number of original characters have been created specifically for interactive media, and the most successful of these have found a meaningful place within the broader fan imagination of the Dragon Ball universe. The custom player characters of Dragon Ball Xenoverse and Xenoverse 2 occupy a unique position in this regard. They are not fixed characters with predetermined designs and personalities, but rather a framework within which each player created their own protagonist. The races and general archetypes available for creation were drawn from Dragon Ball's established character types, but the specific characters that players built were genuinely new. The fact that millions of players created millions of distinct characters means that the Xenoverse games produced a vast number of original Dragon Ball characters, each one meaningful to the player who created them. Android 2-1 from Dragon Ball FighterZ is the most prominent fixed original character the games have produced. Her design, a tall woman with white hair and a lab coat, whose Majin form carries a pink skin tone and dark sclery, was created by Akira Toriyama himself, which gave her an authority that characters designed without his involvement would not have had. Her backstory connected her to the existing android characters in ways that felt considered rather than arbitrary. and her abilities drew from multiple Dragon Ball power sources in ways that made her mechanically distinctive. Shallot from Dragon Ball Legends is another significant original character, an ancient Saiyan of mysterious origin whose memory has been fragmented, whose investigation of his own history drives the game's long-form narrative. Shallot's design follows the visual conventions of Saiyans and Dragon Ball, but places him at a historical remove from the established characters, giving the game's story freedom to explore parts of Dragon Ball's universe that the main series had never addressed. His development across multiple seasons of story content made him a character with genuine narrative investment around him, at least within the community of Legends players. The history of Dragon Ball games is, in part, a history of patience. Patience on the part of the developers who spent years building systems for characters they had known since childhood, who revised combat mechanics across multiple iterations of the same franchise, who animated the same Kamehame for the 100th time and still tried to make it feel right. Patience on the part of the players who waited for each new game, who replayed the ones they had while hoping the next one would improve on what they loved and fix what frustrated them. The players who checked release dates and watched trailers and formed opinions before the games arrived, and then revised those opinions across the hours of play that followed. Patience with the source material itself, with a story that was still ongoing as each new game was made, that provided new characters and new power levels, and new story events that the games had to accommodate or defer until the next release. Dragon Ball Super was still airing new episodes when Dragon Ball FighterZ was in development, and the decisions about which characters to include and how to represent the current state of the story required exactly this kind of patience with the flowing, unfinished nature of an active franchise. There is something appropriate about a Dragon Ball Sleep documentary ending in patience. The franchise has always been about the long journey, Goku traveling across the world to find Dragon Balls, traveling across the galaxy to reach Namek, traveling across universes to find the tournament of power. The journey is the thing, the destination arrives, and then the next journey begins. The games are part of that same spirit of continued forward movement. Each one arrived, was played, became familiar, and eventually became history. And then the next one came. The catalog accumulated, the history deepened, and somewhere in that accumulation is something worth carrying quietly into sleep. The knowledge that good things have been made, that people have worked carefully and with devotion, and that all of it, every pixel, every polygon, every moment of music, was made because someone loved a story and wanted to find a way to live inside it. The games are quiet now, in the way that games become quiet when no one is playing them. The cartridges and discs and digital files that hold the complete history of Dragon Ball gaming exist in a kind of suspended animation, patient, available, waiting for the next person to arrive and wake them. The code that runs each fight, the data that defines each character, the audio samples that reproduce each theme, all of it is there, unchanged, as it was when it was made. The history that surrounds those games is quieter still tonight. The developers who made the earliest Famicom Dragon Ball games are decades removed from those productions. The voice actors who recorded their performances for the first Budokai game are still working, still voicing these same characters in new productions, carrying forward a performance they have now maintained for more than 20 years. The players who encountered Dragon Ball for the first time through a Budokai disc are now the older generation of the fan community, and they understand the history from the inside in a way that no written account can fully replicate. All of that is out there, gentle and patient, like the stars over the landscapes that Dragon Ball's characters have always crossed. The mountains of the Dragon Ball world, the oceans of Namek, the cities and plains and alien territories that have served as settings for the franchise's endless saga of power and growth and finding your way home. Tonight, those landscapes are still. The characters that inhabit them are at rest. The games are waiting on their shelves and their servers and their hard drives. And the history of all of them, every game, every character, every song, every fight, is quietly available for anyone who wants to find it. There is no urgency in that history. It will be there when you wake. Thanks for drifting through these Dragon Ball stories with me tonight. If you're ready for more, there's another calm video waiting just to the left. Let it guide you deeper into rest. You might fall asleep to something new.